Hi, I'm Sudeep Muthedat, Senior Principal Architect at Carta. Welcome back to our series on Azure Spring Apps. In the previous videos, we saw the challenges of running your Spring Boot applications on-prem, the benefits of migrating them to cloud, and we heard a lot more about Azure Spring Apps from Mike and David. Now it's the demo time. We'll migrate an app into Azure Spring Apps. So as mentioned earlier, we'll be using the Pet Clinic app to migrate. So we will be setting up a Azure Spring Apps instance. We will create Azure MySQL. We will deploy the app, this Pet Clinic app, and bind the app into the applications deployed on Azure Spring Apps. So bind the SQL and your app. Now let's see a migration of an app from your on-prem to Azure Spring Apps. We are going to use the Pet Clinic microservices. So as mentioned in the previous videos, this is a sample application. So this Pet Clinic microservices is the public repo, and I have this already cloned in my local and compiled into a jar. The beauty of Azure Spring Apps is you can take this application as it is with no changes and deploy that into Azure Spring Apps. Let's see how to do that. So this is the Azure portal. I have already logged in, and there is already a resource group for that. So first thing that you do is create a Azure Spring Apps instance. So go to the create resource, search for Azure Spring Apps, and you can use the Microsoft version of the Azure Spring Apps. Let's go ahead and try creating it. We need to pick a name. So let's pick the central US as the location. And under the plans, so Mike and David talked about this in the prior video, we have basic, standard, and enterprise tiers. We are going to use the enterprise tier because that's the one that comes with the VMware licensed version of config servers and the service registry and API gateway and many other features. You can select a zone redundancy, but for the purpose of this one, I'm just going to go through. So let me select the terms. So under the VMware Tanzu settings, you can see that a Spring support, the 24/7 support for Spring ecosystem from VMware is already included with this. And a build service is part of the offering as well. We need a build service, that is what will deploy your applications. Beyond that, everything else is selectable. So if you want a service registry, if you want to use an application configuration service or a gateway, API portal, all of this you can select, and whatever that you are selecting, you will only be charged for that. So if you do not want something, for example, for the purpose of this one, I do not want app accelerators or app live view, I'm not going to use API portal or the gateway, you don't have to select that. So let's go to the next one. So here we are enabling the logs, and the logs flow to a log analytics workspace. If you already have one, you can select that. If no, the provisioning of the Azure Spring Apps will create a log analytics workspace for you. Same with application insights. If you have one, you can use, otherwise it will be created. Networking. So Azure Spring Apps provide the option to deploy your application, deploy your Azure Spring Apps into your own virtual network. We are not going to utilize that. We will be directly deploying it on Azure. So let's review and create. So now, for the purpose of this, I'm not going to actually create it. I already have it all set up. But this is all you need to do to select Azure Spring Apps and create that. Now the next part of this is the MySQL. So let's search for MySQL. Now we have the Azure database for MySQL flexible server. So let's use this one, and we can create let's pick a server name that has to be unique. And the location is selected. For a business critical application for your production workloads, you can select accordingly. For the purpose of this one, I'm selecting the development or hobby projects. And these compute and storage, there are several options. You can go here and select whatever is appropriate for your organization. I'm going to keep the default ones here. And authentication can be done by MySQL authentication only, Azure AD, or MySQL and Azure AD. I'm going to use the MySQL authentication here. So once we have this, in the networking, we'll give the public access and allow access from the other Azure resources so that our application can connect with this. We'll keep the security default and now review and create. Again, I'm not going to create it. I already have MySQL created and set up here. So you can see this is the end result of setting up both Azure Spring Apps and Azure Database for MySQL Flexible Server. So once you go inside the Azure Spring Apps, the next step is you have to deploy your applications. So in order for you to deploy your applications, you need to first create them. So here under the app section, you have an option to create an app. So you can give your app name, and since you are going to create it from an artifact and not bringing your own container let's pick the artifacts. We also have the option to bring your own container. And you can give the details of the app name and then add them. So I have already added the 4 apps that we are planning to deploy, which is the API gateway, the customer service, the vet service, and the visit service. Once you have all the apps created, go ahead and move to the service registry where you have to bind each of this app with the service registry. Same with the application configuration. Go here and you have to bind each of the app with this application configuration service as well. In addition to this application configuration, you have to give the path of your Git where you have the configuration, where your config YAMLs, external config YAMLs are present. So you can give that path here, and the patterns. Patterns refer to the application name and the profile. So for API gateway, there is nothing, so it's default. But for customer service, we have to connect to both the default and the MySQL profile. So you have to give that pattern here. This is a comma separated field. You can give the values. Once you are done with this, your applications are ready to be deployed. They are all configured, and you have the service registry and the configuration service, all of them. Oh, one last thing before we do the deployment. The applications that are connecting to MySQL, Azure Spring Apps provide an option called as Service Connector. So you have to bind your application to the MySQL that you have. And what does that give you is it injects all the environment variables that are necessary to connect to your application, connect your application to the MySQL. So go to the service connector and you can create a service connection. Right? You can give the service type, which is here MySQL Flexible Server, and you can select a server name, and you can select the database and the client type as Spring Boot. And then you do. And then next in the authentication, you have to give your username password. There is another option which is using the managed identity, but you can only do that through CLI. So once you do that, you have a connector, service connection available. This enables your application to connect to Azure MySQL. So once all of this is there, head over to your application and deploy that. So the deployment to Azure Spring Apps is through the CLI. So I have the CLI is all logged in, and it's connected to this particular resource group. So I have some commands already pre-written. These are the commands to deploy your application. So there is one each for each of the application. AZ Spring App deploy, and then you give your resource group service, which is your Azure Spring Apps name, Azure Spring Apps name, and the name of your application, and the artifact path where you have the jar, and then your config file pattern that we just saw. Once you execute this, everything gets deployed, and do this one by one. And once all the applications are deployed, make sure that for API gateway, you assign an endpoint. So once you assign an endpoint, it is accessible. And now we have all the applications deployed, and you can see all of them are running, all of them are registered with service registry. So let's go to the API gateway and access the home page, and you can see the pet clinic homepage. Here you can go and search for all the owners, and you can see the owner information along with their pet information. And if you look into here, you can see including the visit information. So the visit information comes from the visits microservice, owner and pet information comes from the customer service, and here you can go and see the veterinarian information which comes from the vet service. So as you can see, we have the pet clinic microservice application, and here we have been able to take that application as it is, compile, package it, and deploy to Azure Spring Apps with no code changes at all. You can see that we did not have to deploy the config server, we did not have to deploy the discovery server, because they all come inbuilt with Azure Spring Apps. And the auto connection to MySQL was made possible using the service connector. So this is the beauty of Azure Spring Apps, where your migration from on-prem to Azure Spring Apps is seamless. As we just saw, it's very easy to migrate your on-prem Spring Boot applications into Azure Spring Apps. For this app, we did not even have to make any changes. It can be deployed as it is into Azure Spring Apps and connect to the Azure MySQL and take advantage of other features like the config server, the discovery server, and also the log analytics and monitor. As part of our work at Carta, we partner closely with Microsoft to help your organization build solutions that provide you the business values needed to achieve your objectives. We would love to hear from you and how we can help you achieve yours. The link to get started is in the notes of this video. Thanks for watching this, and join us for the next video where we show you how to automate all the steps that we have seen here, including the provisioning of the Azure Spring Apps and the deployment of the applications, along with setting up monitoring, alerting, and logging.